So my name's James Chisholm. I'm co-founder of Peeplcoach. The first thing I'd like to do is a very brief acknowledgement of country. I'm coming from the Bunurong country within the Kulin Nation, and just like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and also we've obviously got an audience across, definitely across Australia and potentially overseas. So just want to make that acknowledgement before we get started. The second thing I'd like to just cover off is a couple of logistics. So this session will be recorded in this day and age, which is kind of part of this discussion. Plenty of people will register for these events and ultimately not attend the event, but will want to have either some snippets or some content from the recording. So we are recording the session, and we'll be distributing content to those people who have registered and potentially beyond on our website and on our social media. As I said earlier, we will be taking questions, not only taking them, but we encourage questions from everyone across the audience, and we'll be using the chat feature in the call to monitor your questions and direct them towards the panel. The more questions typically, the better the session. So I really would encourage people to think about what are your challenges, what do you feel that the panel may be able to give you some guidance on, and direct those questions to us through the chat. So I'd now like to introduce our panel. So we have Alana Brittain, and I'm going to ask Alana, rather than me make a feeble attempt, Alana to introduce herself briefly, including a little bit about her career in sales and where she is right now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Look, it's a delight to be here. As James said, Alana Brittain. I've been professionally in commercial roles for the better part of 17 years. I've worked my way up from a rep all the way up to sort of senior leadership, second line leadership roles. And the last 10 years have really been focused around tech. So I was previously at LinkedIn for 7 years, leading the sales solutions team, which is salespeople selling to sales organizations, and I've had the benefit of speaking to nearly every sales leader in Australia and beyond around what is working in the landscape right now and what is changing. And most recently joined Uber to lead their restaurants team, because my first job ever was in retail food. So I've come right back full circle into the family business environment. So lovely to see everyone on the call.
Thanks, Alana. Doug, do you want to do the same?
Yeah, thanks, James, and hello to everyone. My original career, banking and finance with Westpac here in Australia as well as the US, and then I moved into building services and engineering services with a range of multinational companies, Honeywell, Johnson Controls, and always through my whole career I've been on the sales business development side of the organisation, from relationship management in banking through to sort of senior sales roles in multinational companies with, national and regional Asia Pacific responsibilities. Very excited to be part of the call, and looking for lots of questions.
Thanks, Doug and Alana. I will just briefly introduce myself. So James Chisholm, as I say, co-founder of Peeplcoach. My background did cross over with Doug, full disclosure. So we worked at some point together at Honeywell. Generally, my background is probably more in general leadership roles, but has included senior and less senior roles in the sales organisation. The current, I guess, perspective I'd have is both as a co-founder at Peeplcoach, which is clearly trying to scale up Peeplcoach as a business with growth, also dealing with our customers. So we coach leaders and we have a sales coaching program. So we deal with our clients and their challenges and goals around sales and growth. The other thing that's kind of an interesting angle, I think, is I'm also chair of a not-for-profit that gets its funding through the NDIS for people with a disability out of Melbourne. And interestingly, probably the thing that keeps me up the most at night chairing that not-for-profit is ultimately also growth. So what I'd like to do is kick off with a question to the panel. We'll just drive this point home. We want to see some questions as well, so they're not just my questions. But to kick things off, maybe to you, Alana, first. So whatever role I've had, and it could be a general manager role of a region or not-for-profit chair, etc. I honestly see sales is, if not the biggest, but definitely up there with the biggest headaches, concerns, things that keep you up at night as a leader. And I guess as a leader, whether it's deliberate, intentional or not, that pressure on you as a board or an exec does find its way through to the sales organisation. Yeah. So what's your thoughts, I guess, initially on the high pressure environment and how you actually cope with that in sales?
Yeah, and I think I always used to say to my team, if you can survive 5 years in sales and not opt out, then you've probably got what it takes to remain in the profession, because it is tough. And I don't think it is for everyone. And one of the most important reminders is to always separate your identity from your number, because I haven't met a salesperson that has always hit in their career and in their tenure. There are certainly moments where you have events outside of your control where it means you can't. That being said, you are not your forecast, and pride really does come from process, not just the outcome. So when I was at LinkedIn, we did look at ways to try and take the pressure off yourself by controlling the controllables. And there were 3 habits that reps embodied that really allowed them to hit their quota. In fact, 70% of reps right now are not hitting their quota because they're not embodying these 3 habits. And the first was to really understand who is the customer, who is the ideal customer profile, so that you're prioritizing the right leads and not speaking to the wrong people. So that's the first sort of element. The second is around follow-up. And, in sales, I don't know if you know this or you might intuitively understand, but 80% of sales requires 5+ follow-ups. And it's not just email follow-ups, it's text, it's phone calls, it's meetings, but 44% of reps give up after just one go, which is a big problem. So making sure you're structured in your follow-up process. And the third piece, and I think it's particularly interesting right now, is leveraging data and technology to make sure you win. And so, we are living in a very interesting time with Gen AI technology, which is kind of changing the game. And in many ways, you can use that to deburden yourself of all the admin and all the research and all the things that are weighing you down in terms of less customer-facing time. And you can truly break your workflow. And so I would encourage anyone right now thinking about, how do I take the pressure off and make sure I'm spending my time on the right activities, is to have a look at your repeated tasks and think about how could Gemini or ChatGPT or Copilot or any other plethora of tools out there, how could they deburden me from that task so I can spend time with my customers and with the people that matter?
Yeah, fantastic. I'm hoping a whole bunch of people are jotting down a few of those very practical lessons, and lessons that I'm hearing have been learnt with some scars along the way, Alana, like everyone in sales. Doug, some of what Alana touched on there, and particularly that, 5 years, if you get through 5 years, you've probably got what it takes to stay there. And also that this is not for everyone. I'm hearing a fair bit around resilience when Alana speaks there, around building resilience. Some psychological ways to do that around detaching yourself from your number and etc.
Thank you.
If you could maybe address your thoughts around resilience in sales.
Yeah, thanks, James. It is a tough environment, and I like to pick up on one of Alana's points, is that you got to separate yourself from the number. And I think a couple of ways from my experience in doing that is, if you focus on your annual plan, it's going to be a big number, and you're never going to, you think, how am I ever going to get there? And so I think for one of the important things for salespeople is to break that down right? If that's my annual plan, how many orders am I going to need? If that's many orders, how many sales meetings or proposals do I have to put out? How many meetings, right? And chunk it right down, and then focus on the small stuff. And recognize the success along the way. Yes, it was great that I had the follow-up action, to follow up this email, to make this phone call, recognize and tick them off as you go. And the emotional resilience thing, and it's so important these days because we've got that blurring between home life and work life. A seismic shift post-COVID, when all of a sudden we're all working from home and that boundary just got eliminated. How do you put the boundaries in place that help with maintaining your emotional resilience? And I think it comes back to this whole idea of celebrating the successes. And I know in the program that we've put together with Peeplcoach, we focus on an exercise called the 3 good things. What are 3 good things that you achieved? What were the sales skills that you used to achieve them? And lastly, how can you do more of it? All right, and continue with your strengths, because it is about, if you just focus, you're behind your numbers, your negative thinking starts, you start into that spiral of, catastrophizing and awfulizing what's going on in your life. Or you can change the thought patterns and say, well, here are the successes I've had, and here's how I can do more of it.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And I think your point and Alana's fit so well together, because I think the way you answer that question, how can I do more of it, is your final question of the 3 questions around resilience that I know you push through our program. And that final question, how can you do more of it, comes right back to Alana's comments around process. So one of the ways you do more of it is having some non-value add activity done by AI, or looking at your process and your efficiency. So pretty interrelated point around how some of the process and tools like AI actually support you to do more value-adding activity, which is constructive in meeting your target. One thing I'd probably call out when we do our leadership programs, a concept that's often raised for people around resilience is locus of control. I'm not necessarily going to go into it here, but if you're not familiar, if you're on the meeting and you're not familiar with the term locus of control, it might be one to Google and have a look at, because it's really focused on getting your energy and your activity centered around things you can influence at least, if not control, and making sure your energy and activity is not focused on things that are completely outside of your control. It's interesting, AI has already come up. I was going to have a joke and say,
sorry,
thanks, Alana. I'm going to take for someone at AI. So I'm going to fight against Alana here and switch it and say, as important as it is, and believe me, I do see it as important. Sorry, my camera just went, I think. I'll keep speaking. As important as it is, what are some old school learnings that you think have stood the test of time around, I guess, modern sales and successful performance, irrespective of technology change?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious one, and the one that I've always talked about, even as we had technological changes 10 years ago, is relationships, and real ones. Because at the heart of every deal is trust. And I think the flip side to AI being able to augment your role is that we're also living in a time where technology can fake almost anything. And so if you look at, I don't know if you've been following like Google's banana nano imaging, it's extremely realistic and impressive, but it's totally fabricated. So it's interesting. We're kind of working in this world where you can't trust what you see. And so we're coming back full circle to this idea of a relationship economy where you verify the people that you know and you work through them. And so, working at LinkedIn, I know they've done a lot of work previously on verifying your identity, because you can trust people you've worked with in the past. You can trust your referrals. Reputation probably matters more than anything right now. And people like to buy from people. Like that really is, that's the reason that sales is quite a resilient profession, I think, to being totally taken over by AI, because there are so many emotional and human-centric qualities that are required in order to sell. And so I would say, like, the number one thing is relationships. I would say on top of that, we are living in an age where information is democratized and where your buyer is really well informed. But I would say you still need to do your work in terms of discovery before decks. So making sure that you really truly understand your buyer's business, probably more so than ever, because there's a lot that can already be uncovered through these tools. And so you need to understand intimately what they do, but most importantly, how you align. And then I would say, relating to that, particularly now, because capital is still expensive, companies are really only prioritizing one or two things. You know, they're looking at the important few, like the critical few, not the important many. And so attaching yourself to the most important initiative or the top two initiatives that are running through a company today is probably the only way you're going to get a big sale across the line. And I'm talking about enterprise selling, because, yeah, when capital is limited, you really flood it to a couple of priorities, and you need to make sure that you are attached to that priority. Else you need to sell elsewhere. So I would say those principles still remain, regardless of what's changed around us.
Yeah, thanks, Alana. I think the relationship and reputation, did you say relationships or discovery before decks? That's something that jumped out at me big time that you just said. And I'm going to translate it just in case anyone's not 100% clear on that. So discovery being the exercise of understanding the customer's situation, what their requirements are, their challenges, etc., before putting the PowerPoint deck or the solution together for the customer. Danger not spending enough time in discovery is really that you the solution because of the lack of discovery. Doug, there's also a question here from Vinesh on the chat. Not sure whether you've had a chance to scan it, and Alana, the same to you. I think we've touched a fair bit on Vinesh's question, but it actually specifically talks about, you know, how the sales role will change, and I'm sort of reading into this, you know, what sales roles might disappear and be replaced. And I guess partly what I'm sort of taking here is from Vinesh's question is Alana's points about the inability of technology to fully replace the human connection, the genuine relationships, the reputation, etc., and also potentially at this point anyway, potentially not being able to fully substitute the discovery process to get the right solution across the line. So maybe, Doug, if I ask you, is there anything you wanted to add to that around anything old school, so to speak? No aspersions.
No, that's none taken.
Old school, it's still relevant today.
Yeah. I reinforced Alana's point about relationships. To me, it always starts and ends with the customer. And when we think of customers, we think not just of the organisation, but the people within the organisation, because ultimately people buy from people. So you've got to form those relationships, reinforce the discovery before deck. And James, you and I have had this discussion many, many times. To me, it is all about value. Right? What is the value that you can provide to the customer? And so many times, in the number of sales calls I've been on over the years, where, you know, the first thing that gets talked about is, well, why use us? You know, what are the features and benefits of our product? And, you know, my little anecdote is like going to the doctor and you know, the first thing the doctor says to you is, I'm really glad you're here today because I've got the perfect pill for you, without even worrying what your problem is or what you're there for. Right? So, and it's not just about understanding the problem. And I think, you know, what does the problem cause and what are the implications of that problem? Because that is where the real value hides. And I think that goes back to Alana's point, which I think she made really, really well, is follow the money. Right? What are the 2 or 3 key strategic issues that organisations are facing, and how can you help them overcome the implications of those issues?
Can I just, James, I just want to, Vanessa's question, just a little bit more context there as well. And I'm totally, Doug, follow the money. Like wherever the money is being spent, that is where the priorities of the organization are. So I'm totally aligned with that. But on this question of will our profession disappear or not, we did a lot of work when I was at LinkedIn on every occupation out there and auditing all the skills that were behind it. There are certainly skills that will be automated, but they're the skills that we don't enjoy doing. So they're 18 hours a week. Every rep will spend on CRM updating, documentation, and even doing research. It's very manual, so reading through like annual reports, etc. That is the kind of stuff that as human beings we are not naturally geared towards. We've had to adapt to that because the knowledge economy exploded when the computer was invented, and we've started to do all these tasks that we're not great at. When we look at the insulated skill sets, they are, and the number one or two or three rising skill sets that are most important right now, communication was number one, like in the last year, curiosity, like problem solving, collaboration, creativity, like these are, we don't even understand how these work within our own minds. And so Gen AI can't understand it either. I will say as a warning to that though, or the other side, AI literacy is becoming a vast rising skill, if not overtaken. And so you do need to balance both. And I think the takeaway is don't ignore the technology, like embrace it and use it, but don't forget that you've got a very, very valuable skill set as a human being that honestly, it will not go away. Like we've mapped that well into the future, and that is definitely the case. So lean into both.
Thanks, Alana and Doug. And again, great question, Vinesh. I've just put a little plug there. The more we get, the more interactive, the more value. I'm sure this, I guess, almost like the discovery with customers, we can sit there saying what we think is of value to you. You're the customer, so questions, please. In the meantime, I think highly related to this discussion is what I would say is the qualification process. Alana, you mentioned really early in the chat around spending time actually identifying your ICP, your ideal customer profile, spending time on those customers, not on customers that will never lead you to success. If you could maybe kick off by expanding a little bit around the way you see the qualification process and why you think it is so critical for sales success.
Yeah, so maybe something to set context around what is happening in the buyer landscape, which is that buyers are really only in the market 5% of the time, which means 95% of the time they're researching, they're exploring, they're just trying to do their day-to-day work. They're not in the market for your services. And so qualification is incredibly important because you can get very deep in a process with a buyer and then get to the pointy end of whether you think something is there or not. And there's no money, there's no funds, there's no resources, there's no intent. And so I think it's incredibly important to know not only the deals that you want to be focusing on, but the ones you want to say goodbye to, because that's a time waster. The ways to kind of identify that, apart from making sure that you are attaching yourself to the most critical initiative that's happening in that company, is there are some certain tells, I think. I used to tell the team, look for momentum. So if you get quick replies, if you have stakeholders that are pulling in other senior stakeholders, if pain that's already been budgeted is the exact pain you're solving for, like that's the momentum you want to see. And relating to that is speed. If there's no speed, there's probably no intent. So don't confuse interest with urgency. And one of the ways you can tell that is the client is actually doing work on their end and getting things for you. That's probably the ultimate test because they've got skin in the game. So some junior reps that enter the sales force, really, they get happy years and they have someone who's like a talker, who loves to give them information, who loves to kind of keep the conversation going, but there's nothing that's being actually put aside in terms of resourcing, time or seniority towards the sale. And that's where you need to qualify that out and have a look for people who are you really are solving their problem and they are willing to pay for that.
I honestly would say if you could capture what Alana's just said and practice it, it would move the needle on sales success. It's one other way I'd sort of summarize qualification is that if someone is eventually going to say no, the quicker you can get to that point, the better. So it's almost counterintuitive. How do you actually solicit your customer to say no if they're not the right customer? Because if you have them in your pipeline for a lengthy period of time and they end up saying no, that just equals inefficient allocation of your time and effort to what ultimately will deliver zero outcomes versus redirecting that effort to opportunities that at least are possible wins. Doug, big topic, qualification. Anything you'd like to add before I go to Stacey's question, which I think is a ripper as well?
Yeah, look, just echoing what Alana said, it's qualification. We can waste so much time, talking to the wrong people, talking to the wrong organisations. And I think it's just so important from a sales leadership perspective that, there's a robust bid, no bid process in place. Why are we going to, because sales resources are an expensive resource in any organisation. And it's interesting, I've worked in service organisations where the amount of time that, frontline technical people, service tech spend on site, exactly down to the cent how much it costs per hour, exactly what percentage of their time is billable versus not billable. But if you look on even more expensive sales resources, you don't see that level of tracking about where they're spending their time. Are they on the right opportunities? They're talking to the right customer. So the qualification thing is really important. And how many organisations actually have an ideal customer profile? I've worked in a lot of organisations where it didn't exist. And where it does exist, it's a very powerful thing, because as Alana says, there's all those little tells and all those little signs that you look for along the way. When you know what they are, when you can apply those across customers in the same industry, the same geography, you get to look for them and you get to see them much more often. It's that whole frequency illusion thing. If you know what you're looking for, you'll suddenly start to find it more often. So I think it's just tremendously important.
I love your comment, Dean Beaumont, in terms of firstly acknowledging what Alana said and actually thinking about that in a sales flow chart. And I think what Doug's sort of re-emphasised beyond that as well is the role of leadership in driving that discipline around qualification, bid, no bid, early sales leadership and company leadership, insisting on it, defining your ideal customer profile as well. Stacey's thrown an absolute curveball at us, because I think a lot of our discussion has been in, I'd say, sort of free-form sales, like, where we can do our discovery, and discovery meaning back and forth in client discussions, communication, understanding the situation. Stacey's raised a question around tenders and, maybe paraphrasing or expanding on the question, that can in some cases be run in a situation where you are excluded from communication with the customer to further go through discovery. I don't know who of you two want to tackle this first, but I don't think it's quite as an easy question to answer as some of our prior questions. So who's game?
I'll have a crack at it. Having been involved in a lot of tenders, I think it is a real challenge. And I think part of the answer, certainly in my mind, is that why would you respond to a tender when you don't know the customer, right? And if you know the customer, you've probably already had the ability to gather a lot of the information that, you were looking for before the tender wall goes up. So that would be, is it blind? Are you just going on to, one of the websites that issue tender documents and say, oh, that looks like a really good one, I'm going to have a crack at that? My question would be why? So it starts with the customer. Is it the ideal customer profile for us? Do we know the right people? Do we understand their issues? Do we understand where they're spending the money? Right? Okay. We do know that. Therefore, it's an opportunity we could pursue. And knowing some of that stuff before the tender wall goes up, because once the tender wall goes up, the whole idea is to level the playing field.
Yeah.
I can hop on to that as well. I mean, I traditionally have not done many tenders, but we've sold to companies that have. And I would say one practical way to make that happen is, and you touched on it, Doug, is who are the people? And if you work in the industry, you do tend to know the big tenders that are coming up, and you do tend to have a timeline ahead of that. So I would say mapping out the buying circle, which is a lot bigger than probably what you think it is. And so traditionally, when I started at LinkedIn, we talked about 5.6 people in the decision-making circle. That now has grown to 20. And I would say if you're working on very complex tenders, it actually ends up being more like 50 to 100 different stakeholders. And so finding a way, whether it is through LinkedIn or other means, of mapping those personalities, forging relationships with them well and truly prior, so that you do understand what is happening within that organization and whether you even have a shot, whether you could even compete for that tender, is really important. I'd say that's a practical way, like multi-thread, like what you call multi-thread, or have multiple relationships your way through it prior to it, to the wall closing down on you. And that would probably give you a much better chance of winning it, I would say.
Yeah. And maybe just one follow-up point is to separate the buying decision. As Alana just said, there is, buying decisions are made increasing numbers of people in increasing complex ways now. Separate the buying decision from the procurement process, because the tender is a procurement process and it's actually quite separate to the buying decision, right? And so our role in terms of sales, in terms of qualification, is we have to understand the buying process. The buying process, not the procurement process. Yeah. What is the problem? What's the implication? What's the value they're looking for? Where are they spending the money? All right. And they will have made all of those decisions before they say, well, we're going to procure this by a tender, or we're going to procure it by a single select.
That's it. And one last thing on that, the buying circle, yes, it's expanding, but it's also expanding to stakeholders that you never would have had to deal with previously. So expect to see the CFO well and truly in there, expect to see legal, and you have to forge those relationships with them, as well as whoever is getting direct benefit from the product or service that you're tendering for.
Thank you both for those comments. And I do think, so Stacey just qualified that it's mainly state. I think a lot of what we talk about with corporate tenders, it would still to some extent be relevant to government. What I would probably argue, and I, through my career, have had some stages where we've done very big contracts with state government entities. And Doug, I'm pretty sure you can think of some back in Honeywell where we directly did massive service contracts with state governments that were highly structured and tendered. I would say the bid, no bid decision on tenders is probably more important than any other form of sales, because tenders are more time consuming, even with the benefit of AI doing a whole lot of things for you these days that wouldn't have been available to me back in the day. They still require incredible amounts of time and effort. And so to me, the bid, no bid process, I think, has to be more brutal for tenders than in any other form of sales. And I guess another phrase that we use in strategy and leadership, and I think is really important in sales, would be this term, go slow to go fast. And what I kind of mean by that is, understanding that some deeper work now pre-tender with a client will deliver great results to go faster with that client in the future. So yeah, that is definitely, I guess, what I would sort of push pretty hard. So brutal bid, no bid process, really, kind of what I said before on steroids, getting a no out of a customer earlier or qualifying out earlier is probably more important with tenders. Sheila, a very common objection we get from customers is that they are very happy with current suppliers and have no appetite to change. How would you respond? I've got some ideas, but I reckon this is possibly one in both of your wheelhouses, but I'll throw it out there. Who jumps first, Doug or Alana?
I'll let Alana go first on this one.
Oh, thank you, Duff. So gracious. So I think it comes back to what we just spoke about then, which is the buying circle. There is no single decision maker anymore, which means and as the buying circle increases and it is increasingly chaotic, you have a whole bunch of different personalities with different interests, different motivations, and different ideas. And so I wouldn't respond directly to that question around we have no appetite to change. I would probably start forging relationships with more and more people in that company to try and figure out what are the grievances with the current supplier, where are the gaps that they're not meeting, and then come back with a very tailored plan that is totally aligned to their challenges and their objectives, showing that you intimately know the company better than maybe their supplier does. And in the process, as I said, coming back to relationships truly do matter. So if you can find champions within that company, maybe people who have used your services in the past that have moved into that company, I think 20 to 30% of people are moving roles every year. And that's only increasing as we see the younger generations come through with Gen Z and millennials. So there's always a door opener or an opportunity that opens up when you have stakeholders that are moving in and out. And that is when you start a conversation. Yeah. So I would it's never a no. Sometimes it's a not now. And then you have to just do your work to get, a deeper understanding of the organization and the people and wait for the moment where you have a change maker that comes in where you can position that.
Yeah.
Alana, sorry, I'm going to jump in and then give you some more thinking time, Doug. So what I've found in various organizations when it comes to sales and growth, and I think it's the most brutal reality of my career, is life is so much harder if you have no differentiated value to your competitors in the eyes of the customer. It is brutal because the only thing you're generally left with then is price, and that is really tough. Mm-hmm. So what I'm actually sort of distilling from Alana's answer is you can't differentiate to the incumbent with your customer unless you deeply understand their problems, their challenges, their opportunities. And that can mean that question is simply too late for this current opportunity. And then it's about going back and saying they still are an ICP. They will be buying in the future. But at the moment, clearly from their question, I have not been able to demonstrate differentiated value over the incumbent. So I would say it's another example of, is this worth going back and creating those relationships, doing the hard work so that in 6 months' time or whatever it might be, you do know more about the customer than the incumbent and you have a differentiated solution that they value more. If that's not possible, I'd qualify them out. To me, it's over. Doug?
Yeah, absolutely. So my immediate response to that is, why are they happy with their current suppliers, right? Which leads to, what is the value or what do they see in the current supplier that they like about them? And there's always going to be a change, right? People leave organisations, new people come in. Interesting, there's a change in suppliers, right? Personnel. And all of a sudden service standards will drop. So there's always going to be something happen where the current status quo will shift. And as you said, James, then have you done the hard yards? Have you built the relationships? Do you understand, what it is that they like about the current supplier, what they're looking for in the new supplier, so that you're positioned when those opportunities arise. I'm going to put a little plug in here. There's a really, and I'll drop the reference to it on the chat, article that was published in the Harvard Business Review quite a few years ago now called The Elements of Value, 30 Elements of Value. And it looks at what are the things, the elements of value that buyers look for from suppliers, and actually maps it into a pyramid of needs like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The higher up that pyramid you can get, right, the stickier you will become as a supplier to that organization, but interesting to that person, right? Because the interesting thing is, if you get to understand why they're happy with their current supplier and they then move to another organization, why can't you become their supplier at that organization, right? Because you understand what they need and what they look for and value.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doug. And Alana, I do have another question to throw out. We've got just over 15 minutes still taking questions. Doug will put the little reference in there in the chat. That is actually part of the Peeplcoach Sales Impact Program as well that we reference, that 30 elements of value. Just a totally sort of different, I guess, question would be, I've sort of worked in different regions and worked a lot in the US. This is maybe a bit contentious, but I believe that in Australia, in business culture, sales and salesman, salesperson, saleswoman is kind of a dirty word. And my experience in some other countries, and particularly the US, is it's almost the exact opposite. And this is not me saying, especially this day and age, the US have all the right approach and the right answers to everything. But I would say it's an interesting thing. Alana said right at the start, sales is not for everyone. But what I sort of fear sometimes is people that are considering sales in Australia potentially get perturbed by how sales is perceived in Australia versus overseas. Now, Alana, I know LinkedIn and, you've got history with Uber as well, but what's your take on that? And what would you say on that topic to people weighing that up in Australia?
Yeah, I would say I'm trying to change. I'm a proud salesperson. And I remember when I first got into the profession, I did have that hesitation actually, because sales encompasses everything from a transactional seller, from like a car salesperson, to an unbelievably strategic, complex selling motion where you are actually seen as more of a consultant and an extension to the company that you're selling from. And I think particularly now, the bar for sales is so high. It's changed so much since even I began in terms of what you must do, how the business acumen you have to acquire to be able to sell, like the subject matter expertise. But I did notice that when I first started out, because I've worked for both US companies and Australian companies. And to answer that question, I think it does come down to the culture of the countries. So an Australian buyer is different to a US buyer, and so is the culture around selling as a result. And you're right, in the US, sales is often celebrated. It's very ambitious. It's a way to climb in your career. You'll find also on the buyer side, people are more willing to engage with you as a salesperson because they're ambitious and they want to climb the ladder. But I would say in Australia, we're a little bit more understated. Tall poppy syndrome is still very much a real thing. Career ambition does exist, but it's a little bit quieter, and your buyer is incredibly apathetic. And so I think personally, Australian salespeople are the best in the world, because to be able to convince other Australians to take the plunge and buy when they are very much risk averse and kind of, they need to really be convinced. They're very contrarian in how they engage with you and very willing to kind of challenge you, because we don't have this like authoritarian structure in our country culture. So that is probably the big difference between Australian and US selling, is you've got to be really good in Australia to be able to convince not just one, but a whole consensus of Australians to buy. That being said, I do think things are changing and I am seeing a shift. I've seen younger demographics now, instead of being pushed into law or pushed into engineering, being pushed into somewhere like tech sales because there's so much benefit to it. It's such a great career. You get to meet different people. You get to have these really strong relationships. You get to hone your business acumen. You get to understand strategy at the exact level where it's being formed, and you get to make really good money for the lifestyle that you lead. So I would say anyone who is thinking about entering into sales, if you are a curious person who loves to solve problems, if you love relationships and forging them with people and learning, and if you want flexibility, but also to maintain a really good income at the same time, this is the profession for you. It's super challenging, but it's very rewarding and it's very interesting and different. So that's what I would say to that.
Great pitch on being a salesperson, Alana.
Yeah, well done. You've sold me.
Doug, you've worked for American companies, for Australian companies, for a massive Australian company living in America, and all with a salesman. Anything to add or differ on that perspective?
Yeah, I think that I'd reinforce your initial comments that in the US, sales is seen as a genuine profession. And it's like you can become an accountant, you can become a lawyer, you can become an engineer, you can become a sales professional. And so many of the major US corporations have their graduate entry programs where people come into the sales stream and they go through the whole talent development, over a period of time before they're ultimately let loose in the market. We tend not to have that so much in Australia. People come into sales by so many different ways. And the other thing I'd point out is, and it just reinforces what Alana said, the way that people tend to buy in America, most larger corporations in the US have specific purchasing departments or procurement departments, very, very professional, experienced buyers, whereas in Australia, we tend not to have that so much. It's almost person to person, right? So that makes a difference. The other spin I'd put on this, working in a lot of organizations where the most important part of your sales capacity are frontline, customer-facing technical people who, if you call them a salesperson, they would be insulted, right? And think you're swearing at them. But if you say to them, what do you like about your job? Oh, I love going to the customer sites. I love figuring out their problems. I love solving their problems, right? What happens when you've solved their problem and you send them an invoice? Oh, and they pay the invoice. You've just made a sale, right? So the focus is not on the sale. The focus is on problem solving, helping the customer, figuring out what their issues are, coming up with the solutions for them. People love doing that, right? We've just put this sales word on it that, people think of the shiny skinned real estate or used car salesman, and that's not what it's about. So we've got some work to do.
Great. Thanks to both of you. I was going to ask, but I've seen John Carroll pop up a question here. I'm going to read it out, sight unread, so I hope it's a good one, John. Sales may not have a direct quota, but everyone in an organisation is a salesperson. Salesperson's role now is to mobilise and gather the collective power of the organisation. Salespeople haven't got a fraternity, but you can align project managers, engineering, and like-minded people who will positively influence the decision-making process in your favour. Yeah. Our role is to encourage others in your company to contribute in this manner. Very much along the lines of what Doug was saying. Agreed. And funnily enough, it leads to a question I was going to raise, highly related. There's actually, and Doug touched on it, there's often a tension between sales and other functions in Australia. And I have definitely seen and heard comments from people outside of sales, I guess making their judgments about the sales role, how it's all lattes, meetings, et cetera, and I guess, that's a perception that salespeople actually do need to front up to, if that's a perception that exists, like if your customer has a perception. And as John Carroll said, if you genuinely want to have the technical workforce and various working with you on the, you know, that tension and that barrier between sales and other functions. So any sort of proactive, positive tips from Alana or Doug on how you build, I guess, what John's identified as the ultimate state?
Yeah, James, I think that tension is a good word, and my take on this is you've got to have that level of tension in an organisation. It's a bit like you put a piece of metal under tension, it becomes stronger, right? If you've got that internal tension in an organisation, and where sales are questioning what can be delivered, ops are questioning what's being sold, right? It's going to be a stronger organisation as long as there is alignment. And I think one of the quickest ways to have a very unhappy, dissatisfied customer is when what gets sold doesn't get delivered. And so that alignment and the handover process, right, which, can happen right from the very first time as this, outlining what an ideal customer profile looks like. Does it line up with our operational capabilities, technical capabilities? The alignment needs to start right at that point, all the way through the discovery process, all the way through the proposal process, and even when the deck, do you have the operational people in the room when the deck gets presented? Right? That alignment needs to be there all the way through.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'll just make a comment and then get your thoughts, Alana. So there was a mantra of the global would actually use the phrase no solo flights. And that was just fundamentally a belief that a salesperson going out and doing everything on their own in isolation of the people who know our solution well is destined for failure compared to team selling. Now that is definitely that varies in terms of what industry you're in and the solution, the complexity, etc. As you would have said, Alana, earlier, around how complex that sales environment can be versus not be. But yeah, that no solo flights is potentially one to think about from a leadership perspective. So Alana, I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts in the next couple of minutes, and then I'll bring things to a wrap for the top of the hour.
I have so many thoughts on this. So no solo flights. We used to say sales is a team, selling is a team sport. And certainly the best selling motions I've ever been involved with have been across the board with a lot of your cross-functionals involved, either directly with the customer or in a room where they're giving their perspective on what is possible, what we can execute on, and are we aligned. The flip side to that is when you've got so many different people that have different tension points. I did bring, my husband's a pilot, and I did bring him into the LinkedIn organization at one stage just to talk about how do you effectively work in small groups like that. And at the end of the day, there are some rules that we can take from aviation around, like, someone has to be the captain in that scenario. You have to have someone who is slightly leading it. That doesn't mean that you don't take input from others, but you definitely need someone driving it, else you're rudderless and directionless. And the other sort of rule there is open communication. So in the pilot world, that means that the first officer can challenge the captain if things are going wrong, and that's very deliberate because it's a safety issue. But it's the same in an organization where a sales leader, or the person who is highly paid, may be making a decision and others in the room feel like that is the wrong decision. You need to have that open communication within the group to effectively sell to your customer, else you will make a mistake, and then that mistake is very costly. But I'd say keep your cross-functionals always on board, because you have no idea how much they can help you and how much extra they can give to you and your customer, either directly or indirectly in the process.
I'm going to just share an anecdote of probably one of the best salespeople I've ever worked with. That person was based in Melbourne, and for the organisation that I was working with had a call centre in Sydney. And the call centre was the experience for a service that this salesperson was selling. And every time this salesperson went to Sydney, he would come into the call centre with lollies, chocolates, flowers, whatever it might be, not in a sucky way, genuinely saying, thank you, I could not. So something that I'm a big believer in from a leadership viewpoint is catch people doing something right. So I think as sales people, you know, what Alana and Doug are sharing, what John's saying, that all technically does make sense. But in terms of sustaining the support and the communication, you probably won't get lasting support if you don't actually give reinforcement, recognition, reward for positive behaviour that helps your sales. And I have seen plenty of salespeople underestimate how powerful empathetic leadership is, even if you're not a sales leader, just a sales person, how you actually empathise with those around you, what they're doing for you, what challenges they face in the role while they have to take time out to go out on a sales call with you. If you are completely unempathetic about what they're doing for you, it's likely to end in them not deciding to support you as vigorously in the future. We have 2 minutes left. What I did want to sort of wrap up with is a lot of this call has been on key behaviours that really are essential for sales success. I guess complacency is something we haven't directly discussed, but there was another phrase that used to get bandied about in an organisation I worked in, and that was that the rookie thinks they've won right up until they've lost, and the veteran thinks they've lost right up until they win. And you know, you don't want unnecessary levels of anxiety in what's already a stressful job. So that's got to be balanced with resilience and those methods we've talked about. But I guess at the other end of the spectrum, complacency around that discovery process and the follow-up statistics that Alana mentioned up front are all also about not being complacent and having that mindset. So I wanted to just say thanks so much for the people that attended live here. We'll be sharing excerpts of this with people in our socials and beyond. Alana and Doug, thank you so much for being amazing panelists. And if people do want to know more about our sales impact program, peeplecoach.com, you can jump on there and have a look at what we offer. So thanks so much for everyone for joining the webinar, and thanks again to Alana and Doug.
Been a pleasure.